Every few years, you might hear about El Nino in the news. You might also see powerful images of flooding and rainfall at the same time. And a big misconception is that El Nino is just a storm, but it's not just a storm. It's actually a whole climate pattern. And we'll get into a little bit more about what that means. And it takes place in the Pacific Ocean. Now, a fun fact about how El Nino was named is that South American fishermen one year noticed that the Pacific Ocean was warmer than it normally is. And this brought about an abundance of fish, which made them very happy. So they named this peculiar event El Nino to correlate with the commemoration of Christ in that part of the world during Christmas. So you'll also notice that you don't hear about El Nino every year, and that's because it doesn't come about every year. It actually averages about every 2 to 7 years. And scientists are still not sure what triggers it. So, yes, it's true that an El Nino can bring about heavy rainfall and flooding, but it can also cause severe drought. It all depends on the region. So, that's a really big thing to remember is that different regions around the globe can experience different effects of El Nino. And sometimes a mild El Nino year can bring about much needed rain, while a severe El Nino can bring devastating weather events. We can see the different effects by looking at the biggest El Nino on record, which took place during the 1997 to 1998 season. This season was really large scale and it caused destructive mudslides in California. At the same time, it caused heavy rainfall along the coasts of Ecuador and Peru. And at the same time, it caused extreme drought and fires in Indonesia. So all of these different regions were affected differently by the same climate phenomenon that was taking place. And El Nino events at this scale have the potential not just to change the weather, but to spread waterborne diseases, to displace people, to cause large scale damage. In fact, in this 1997 to 1998 season, there's estimates that there were $36 billion in damages. So they can get quite large. So, how can the same weather phenomenon cause such drastically different effects all around the globe? First, we have to understand the normal years, the quote unquote normal years, meaning the years when we are not experiencing an El Nino event. So, during these quote unquote normal years, we have trade winds along the tropic region that are pushing or blowing warm surface water toward the west, toward Asia, and away from Central and South America. So, warm water begins to accumulate on the west side of the Pacific Ocean. So, we'll use pink here to indicate that. This will represent that warm water accumulating. And on the east side of the Pacific Ocean, cold water from the bottom of the ocean gets pushed to the surface. And we call this process upwelling. So upwelling is what causes this cold water to be pushed up. And we're representing it with the blue color here. So this is what a normal year looks like. Okay, now let's look at what changes during an El Nino year. Those same trade winds we were talking about before actually get weaker, or sometimes they even reverse. So instead of 3 arrows, I'm just going to illustrate it with one small arrow. So the trade winds are weaker, which means that there's less wind pushing the warm water east. So it starts to accumulate toward the center or towards South and Central America. So instead of it being all the way towards Asia, it starts to accumulate more towards the center. Or if the trade winds actually reverse, it could get even closer to Central and South America. And of course, we have upwelling happening on the other side. So we get that cold water coming in instead. This image does a great job of showing how the warm water accumulates on the east side of the Pacific Ocean during an El Nino event here. So this will cause more rainfall on this side of the Pacific Ocean. And colder ocean water will cause more drought on this side of the Pacific Ocean. So we start to see how it is possible that during this El Nino event, we can have heavy rainfall in places in South America while also having extreme drought in places like Indonesia. So let's come back to our El Nino drawing and let's talk about how this affects weather in the US. The way I like to think about it is that during El Nino, warm water starts to accumulate on the east side of the Pacific Ocean. So let's come back to our El Nino drawing. Now let's talk about how this affects weather in the US. The way I like to think about it is that during an El Nino event, warm water starts to accumulate on the east side of the Pacific Ocean. So the Pacific jet stream moves south and you get more rain in the east and Gulf Coast parts of the US, the southeast and Gulf parts. So this becomes relatively more wet. So when the warm water is on the east coast of the Pacific Ocean, you get more rainfall on the east coast and the Gulf regions of the US, which in turn means that you have a drier season for the northern parts of the US and for Canada. So regions up here become more dry. But wait, let's quickly look at El Nino's counterpart, which is known as La Niña. A La Niña event is essentially the opposite. So this time, the trade winds get even stronger than the normal years. So I'm going to illustrate that with a lot of arrows. So we have trade winds that are even stronger, which means that the warm water is getting pushed even further to the west side of the Pacific Ocean. So normally, where it might accumulate along the coast, it actually gets now, in a La Niña event, pushed even further west. This increases the upwelling of cold water on the coast of the Americas, and it pushes the jet stream north. So when the warm water is more west in a La Niña event, we will get more rainfall in the northwest part of the US and Canada. And this will mean a drier season and potentially a drought for the southern regions of the US. So now that the warm water is further west, then we get more water on the west and the northwest regions of the US. So the next time you hear about El Nino in the news, you'll know that they're not just talking about a really big storm, but that this is a climate pattern that can affect weather all across the globe.